Is for today, everything's okay, everything's okay. Never comes again, another day like yesterday. Is for today, everything's okay, everything's okay. Good morning, everybody. I am going to talk through something that has come on to the psychology landscape over the last couple of decades. And there are many different ways of looking at it and talking about it. But there is an elegance to how this thing functions that I haven't heard identified. I'm sure there are clinicians who are aware of it or maybe who have identified it, but I'm just going to go ahead and break this one down to its finer components. So the concept is the concept of the trauma bond. And if you're not familiar with the trauma bond, what it means is it can be outside romantic relationships, but typically it tends to be in romantic relationships, long-term relationships. It can be in friendships, but it is at the really, really simple level. It's a situation in which there are two people who had really difficult childhoods, who are very traumatized, and they bond with one another based on their pain and their suffering. And this can feel really good, right? To have somebody who understands what you went through and who is also, you can trust sharing your difficult experiences, and you can trust sharing that sometimes you lose it and you break down and you feel like you're not a human being and that you're not going to make it. And you can't share that kind of stuff with some people, right? There are people who haven't had those childhoods, don't really understand that. They feel a little weirded out. They feel disturbed. They don't know what to say. They may even want to help, but they feel a little disturbed. Mental health still has stigma attached to it, right? So it can feel good to have a friend or a spouse or a significant other who also went through something difficult and sort of knows the landscape and sees you spin out for a couple days, and that doesn't freak them out. They're like, hey, I've done the same thing. It's going to be okay. And who can listen to you while you say things that might sound crazy to other people. So on the surface, a trauma bond sounds in some ways kind of attractive. It's not like anyone wants to be traumatized, but to have someone who understands what you went through and knows the landscape of it, and when you're, fall down some dark hole in the landscape, they're just like, yeah, that's part of the landscape. I get it. It happens to me too. Let me give you a hand. That sounds great. Let's go one level under that, because that's what a trauma bond is, or at least appears to be from a very positive standpoint. The next level of trauma bond, therapists have multiple ways of looking at this. And it is a case where you may see someone who was raised by a severely alcoholic parent, and it was chaotic and it was crazy, and they grow up with severely codependent, learning to take care of an alcoholic, and that's natural. And then they grow up and they meet someone who seems healthy and they get married, and it turns out on the down low that this person drinks too much. They might be functional, they might look different, but they drink too much and they begin slowly spinning out. And then here is this person who grew up codependent with an alcoholic parent, once again having to accommodate, support, take all of the emotional weight, the financial weight. They're the one paying the bills because their spouse can't really keep it together. And you look at that and you're like, well, that's a trauma bond. And the alcoholic is also traumatized. Otherwise, they wouldn't be an alcoholic, right? Severe addiction comes from some level of attachment trauma or trauma in childhood. And so that person is also choosing someone who will take care of them, who will repeat whatever they saw in childhood. Maybe they saw an alcoholic parent being cared for. Maybe they were the one who cared for. Maybe they switched the roles, but it's this familiar environment, right? And so therapists will explain that sort of stuff by saying, well, at a simpler level, we can just say, well, people feel attracted to what they grew up in. It might not be comfortable, but it's the norm. It's what's normal for them. So it feels familiar is a better word than comfortable. Feels familiar. If you want to look at that physiologically, if you take an adaptable animal and it's born in an environment where everybody's a cheetah, and you need to develop a narrower and narrower and thinner frame and a longer and longer spine with a long tail for balance and a deep chest for increased lung capacity and lighter muscles, et cetera, you're in an environment and you adapt to that environment to become a cheetah, you have this one super skill. You're really good at being really, really fast. And so a cheetah is not going to grow up and seek out water. It's not going to go like, well, let me go be a fish. Even if the environment in which being fast becomes really toxic and it's really not good, and it's not good to be a cheetah anymore, a cheetah is going to still try to be a cheetah because it developed all of its coping skills and all of its adaptations were for speed, and that's how it built itself. That's the environment it was built in. So its physiology and its programming is going to continue to seek an environment in which it can use being fast, right? So the person who was raised with an alcoholic parent develops this super skill of dealing with the chaos and the unpredictability and taking on extra emotional baggage and extra emotional weight and being ultra responsible and being codependent. And that becomes this highly adaptive super skill. And so then that person goes out and unconsciously seek situations in which they can use and express their super skill. And then they end up in these situations and therapists are like, well, they're repeating the trauma of the past because that's what they're good at. Or another theory is that it was so overwhelming and we felt so victimized by it that we grow up and we recreate the situation in an attempt to win. So maybe there's a sense that we're trying to overcome that trauma, right? So in situations where there's maybe a woman who has violent parents who physically abuse her, she'll grow up and she'll marry a man or a woman who is violent towards her. And people will say, how could you do that? Like, you escaped your family, and that will happen sometimes multiple times. Then they'll divorce that person, they'll find someone else, and it'll turn out that person's violent. And it's like therapists will explain that by saying, well, maybe they're attempting to win or overcome or establish mastery over this trauma, when the truth is they need to recognize that there's no winning for anyone in that situation, and they need to stop doing it. The winning of it is the letting go of it, right? Okay, I'm not going to go through all the theories, but essentially these are all just mental constructs. There's no way to scientifically test that that's what someone's doing when they trauma bond. But there is a more elegant way that this happens that may have spiritual significance that I don't have an explanation for, because as a therapist, I don't try to talk you through spiritual truths, whether the universe offers you things or God offers you things, or whether whether you came in to this incarnation with the intention to learn something in this lifetime, and this is what this theme is. But I can tell you that there's something very mysterious going on with trauma bonds that's much, much deeper than the first level of like, oh, I just chose someone who could understand me because they also were traumatized. And it's even deeper than the level of, oh, you're trying to overcome your childhood trauma, so you keep repeating it. Or it is the skill set and adaptation that you're familiar with, and so you just move to things that are familiar, even though they're toxic. It's deeper than that because it's more elegant than that. Truly, what a trauma bond is, it's not just that I've developed this coping skill of dealing with someone who has this issue. And that issue may be that they're abusive or severely dysfunctional in a way that creates toxicity for their partner or for people around them. When people come into therapy, they're often confused. So I'm going to answer that question. But before I do, I want to give you this context. When people come into therapy, they're often confused because even people who are really good at abstract thought and think in very complex ways, emotionally, many of us are still doing black and white things. And we're doing it from a good place with good intentions. So we might have a partner who's problematic for us. And we stay in it, we struggle, and we try to figure it out because society has offered us two interpretations, typically. One interpretation is like, oh my God, and therapists do this too. There's a mistake that therapists make. Either, oh, your partner is really toxic and low-key or medium abusive, and you're just allowing this behavior and struggling with this behavior because you had an abusive parent in childhood and you don't have good boundaries. And so our therapy is going to be this process of you slowly learning to value yourself and to set boundaries and to realize that if your partner cannot stop behaving this way, right, then that you must move on. So to a certain extent, what you're doing is going, oh, well, maybe your partner really is dysfunctional and your only dysfunction is your willingness to put up with their dysfunction. Or the other thing people struggle with is, my partner says, yes, I behave badly, but you have these terribly toxic, frustrating behaviors. You're really unfair to me. And you have some things you need to fix. And so as decent, empathetic, compassionate people, as people who are like, well, I don't want to be narcissistic. I don't want to sit here and go, oh, my partner's a problem. They're terrible. They're telling me I'm an issue. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I do things to them that anger them and they don't behave correctly, but they wouldn't behave that way if I would stop really being toxic towards them. And so then people come into therapy and they go, am I the problem? Now so you see where this is binary, because the only two interpretations are either my partner's a problem and I need to work through what it is to set boundaries and to recognize that I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm a good person and I don't deserve to be treated this way. And they have to change their behavior or else I'm going to move on, which makes them wrong. They're wrong. They're the problem. Or I'm the problem and I'm eliciting this behavior because I behave really badly and my partner doesn't deserve this and they're just struggling to deal with the fact that I behave in a bad way. So therefore it's my fault and I'm the one who's wrong. Most people who come into therapy struggling with relationships are struggling with this idea. Is my partner wrong or am I wrong? Here's where trauma bonds get really interesting. Really interesting. And this can fit into various spiritual models, which I'll refer to, but I don't have an opinion. I don't know what's true about the situation, but I know what happens in trauma bonds. In a true trauma bond, I will have really difficult experiences in my childhood that will leave me with this generalized, unconscious, very stubborn coping mechanism, an emotional, psychological way of being. So let me concretize that. Let's say I have a mother or a father who's violent and sort of chaotic and unpredictable. In childhood, I will develop this very consistent feeling of being helpless and overwhelmed and victimized. And as I grow up in response to that, I'll develop this anger. but not a healthy anger. This anger, like there's nothing, I'm trapped, like the world is full of shit, and like people are assholes, and like I'm the one being good, and I'm trying as hard as I can to be good, and that person will be very careful. They'll never speak with anger. They'll feel the anger, but they are overly compulsive about regulating their own social emotional responses, and they'll have extreme self-discipline and always being very even and very kind and very diplomatic in how they respond. But inside this will be a real anger and a rage that they do this, but because their parents are their entire universe, it's like the world, the universe, and reality is so unfair to me. So now I have this permanent victim emotional state and psychological state in which I discipline myself and I compulsively regulate myself to always behave in a way that's not angry and not violent and is well regulated, while the world is unfair to me. And it's unconscious because I walked around with that being built in by my childhood experiences. Okay, this is mine. Once I grow up and leave home, this is mine. It's unfair that it's mine, but it's mine. It's unfair that it's mine, but it's mine. Let me pause that. We'll come back. Okay, call from my wife. I just wanted to see what was going on. So, to pick up where I left off, it's mine, but it's not my fault. I'm not responsible for how my parents treated me in childhood. I'm not responsible for the fact that that elicits from children certain coping skills and behaviors. And those coping skills and behaviors will be matched to my personality. Someone who has a more aggressive, less controlled personality will develop the same anger and chaotic behavior and violence that their parents had, and they'll become like their parents. Someone who's more diplomatic and introspective will develop the self-discipline and the self-management to be like a really nice person, right? So the coping skills that you develop in response to that unfair thing are integrated with your personality. They're a reflection of your actual real inborn personality. And it's not fair. It's not your fault that it happened to you. But now, let's say, God forbid, your parents die when you're 18, they disappear, and you're now in the world, and you have the opportunities to sort of find the kind of people that you want to find. You can like do anything you want, but you're walking around with this unconscious, compulsive self-discipline of always regulating and keeping a clamp on your own emotional responses, but an inner rage underneath that everything's so unfair, and it's always you doing all the work and other people being violent or angry or chaotic or irrational. And it's unconscious. You walk around with this because your entire childhood was just that. So your nervous system, right, you got made into a cheetah, or you got made into a whatever. So it's yours because it's in your brain wiring, and it's in your biology, and it's in your gut biome, and it's in your habits, and it's in your psychology, and it's interwoven with your personality. So it's not yours because it's your fault, but it's yours because it's now in there, and nobody can do anything about it but you. Okay. So this is what happens. I don't know why this happens. It sounds metaphysical, pseudo-spiritual. I'm not speaking to that. I don't know why it happens. But this person will unconsciously find people who justify their emotional state. You can explain this any way you want, right? Trauma therapists often say the only thing worse than, for example, feeling anxious is feeling anxious without a reason to justify your anxiety. We want the outside to match the inside. So if I have been conditioned to feel really, really anxious, we will seek situations that create anxiety, and we might bemoan that. But the truth is it's more comfortable to have something that gives me a reason to feel anxious, because then at least I can go, well, when I don't have this job anymore, or when this or that happens, then maybe I won't feel so anxious. At least we have something to blame it on. at least the world makes sense. I feel very anxious all the time. Well, of course that makes sense. I'm not crazy. There's not something wrong with me. There's all of these things like giving me a good reason to be anxious. Right? So, and I think that's a pretty good explanation, right? Trauma therapists explain it as we want the outside to match the inside. So this person has this unconscious, really tight self-discipline. They're extremely nice, extremely diplomatic. They're always managing their own responses. They never allow their own responses to get out of control. If they do, they feel very guilty, very ashamed. At some level, they believe that they're turning into their parent if they lose their temper or if they hurt someone's feelings. So they're always managing that. But underneath that is this intense rage about how unfair the world is, and that they do all this emotional work to be decent to others and other people are not decent. So they'll go out into the world, and guess what they do? They find someone who will make their internal state make sense. Their internal state is a state in which the world is unfair, other people are out of control and chaotic, other people are violent and aggressive, and other people are unfair. So what are they going to find? They're going to find the spouse who is aggressive, chaotic, and irrational, because when they, well, you can look at it a lot of ways. You can say, well, they don't have the boundaries to say no to that person, and someone else will say no to that person. But it's sort of freakish how consistently this person will find this person and stay with them. They'll even recognize it early. People who are in therapy will be like, I'm dating this person. I don't know. They remind me of my mom or my dad. Maybe I should, maybe I should. And they'll talk themselves into continuing to date them and getting married and then having kids. And they'll be like, oh my God, I'm trapped. I had kids with this person. And now what am I supposed to do? Blah, blah. It's like, I don't have an opinion about that. What I'm saying is, a true trauma bond, you have no idea how muscular and compulsive it is that this person will choose that person who justifies their emotional, psychological state. For me to have a justification of this emotional, psychological state, I need someone who is irrational, chaotic, and aggressive towards me. Because if this person doesn't behave that way, my emotional state is now free-floating, this wacky, free-floating internal state that doesn't match anything in my environment, and I'm left feeling crazy, and I'm left being responsible for something that a deep instinct in me tells me this was not my fault. I didn't do this to myself. But I have to face the really difficult, painful, grief-stricken fact that this happened to me in my childhood, and now I walk around with this very compulsive, unconscious, deep emotional posture, emotional and psychological posture, that if I don't have someone who recapitulates my parents' behaviors, I'm left to go, fuck, what do I do with this now? Well, there's a lot of hard work and a lot of feeling ashamed, and a lot of going like, oh my God, I am my problem. And then going, that's not fair. Like, how could I be my problem? How does this get blamed on me? It's not blamed on you. But it's yours to solve. It is incredibly unjust, but it's yours to solve. Okay. So that's that person, right? Mr. or Mrs. compulsively diplomatic, compulsively self-controlled, always taking on all of the emotional work and the emotional weight of dealing with this other person's chaos and irrationality and aggressive behaviors, and that person doesn't take responsibility. And they're like, well, I am who I am, and like, I don't know, what do you expect? Like, I'm not supposed to have any emotions, and right, but they're so unfair and childish about it, and this person is just like holding on for dear life, but secretly underneath, like really angry and really resentful that I'm dealing with this again. Like the world is full of these people. So at a very compulsive, unconscious level, this person will insist that the whole world is this way. And in that way, they can never choose. They can never see people who are not that way. They don't see them. If they don't see them, if they do see them, they feel really scared. They feel terrified. They have panic attacks. They feel high anxiety. They feel confused. They don't feel like they know who they are. And so they will avoid people who are not like that, like the plague. They will avoid it. A woman who was attacked and beaten by her father will marry violent men, and men who are kind and compassionate and respectful of her body and her personality and her psychology and her as a human being will be entirely unattractive to her. In fact, often the problem in romantic relationships is that person will only be sexually attracted to people who have the emotional content of their parent. What are you going to do? They may even recognize, oh, there are men or women who are not like that, but they don't find them sexually attractive. They only find that woman who was abused by her father only finds abusive men sexually attractive. They're dangerous and they're a little out of control, and she's turned on by it. Shit, what do we do now? This is how tough it is. The trauma bond is deep. Okay, it's going to get deeper. Wait for this. Wait for this. It's nuts. It's really nuts when you look at it. Okay, so you have this person over here, controlled, right? And they bring this controlled, angry, but controlled and managed and emotionally self-disciplined, unconscious way of being. And they choose someone who's overly aggressive, irrational, emotionally childish, because it justifies staying in this state. Because if they didn't choose that person, they would have to look at that state and try to figure out, holy crap, what do I do with this? I feel so confused. And they would have to confront the terror and the fear that comes when they associate with people who are not like that, let alone to romantically bond with someone who's not like that. Okay, so here's where it gets deeper. We're sort of making this person over here wrong, right? The person who's irrational and blah, blah, right? But it's a trauma bond. Both people are traumatized. This person, if they go to therapy, do you know what their narrative is? They were raised by a cold, detached, withholding parent who never expressed emotions and never expressed anger, but that parent underneath had this real rage underneath. And that parent will have acted as if when this person was a child and had normal emotions and normal emotional range and lost their temper sometimes and got upset sometimes, blah, blah, their cold, withholding, self-disciplined parent would have acted like, would have shamed them for having emotions. This person over here would have been victimized by a cold, withholding, detached parent who refused to allow them emotions and refused to allow them to have any emotional dynamic, and shamed them when they expressed anger and shamed them when they were sad and didn't allow them to get too happy and told them, no, don't get a big head. You know, you're getting out of control. Nobody likes that. And would have controlled and shut things down and withdrawn anytime this person had emotions. So this person was terribly traumatized and neglected in their childhood, and they responded. Their coping skill in childhood was not self-discipline, but their coping skill was to intensify their emotional responses to attempt to overcome a withholding, cold, detached parent. I geek out because it's so elegant. It's so elegant. It's so elegant. How do we do this? Why do we do this? Why does this system exist? This person had a cold, detached, quietly angry parent who, at any sign of any emotional variation in their child, They withdrew, they shamed, or they just went quiet and withdrew and were like very polite, but not warm and not engaged and didn't engage this person. So this person was abandoned and abused very badly. And their response was to intensify their emotion and intensify their emotion and intensify their emotion because they were an abandoned, lonely, scared child who was growing up in an emotional vacuum, screaming, please listen to me, please pay attention. And as they got angrier and more emotionally expressive, that parent got further away. So now this person is badly traumatized, and their coping skill is to intensify emotional expression. So they go out into the world, and who do they choose? They choose the person who needs someone. Well, no, let's say it for their side. They choose someone whose coping skill is to present as shut down and detached in response to emotional expression. Neither person is right and neither person is wrong. It's a trauma bond. They're both bringing their trauma coping skill that they've adopted and internalized at a deep unconscious level, and their trauma skill triggers the other person's trauma skill that presents as if this is the abusive parent or the negligent parent. And so when this person copes with their trauma skill, they appear like the abusive parent. And so then this person intensifies their coping skill, which presents like this person's abusive parent. And what do? This is a cheetah. This is a shark. They just do what they do. They do what their trauma skill instinct is. And they intensify their coping skill and they intensify their coping skill. But remember, this coping skill presents like this person's abusive parent, and this coping skill presents like this person's abusive parent. And so they're triggering in one another the very coping skill that presents like the abuse they experienced in childhood. I need to say that again. They are triggering in one another coping skills that present like the abusive parent that they experienced in childhood. Each person is triggering in their partner a trauma coping skill that presents to them like their own abusive parent that they experienced in childhood. So they have now elicited the same environment that they grew up in by trying to protect themselves with the only coping skill they ever had, and it's not even conscious. Is there a God? Is the universe conscious? Is there a reason that this is so elegant? When I say elegant, you understand, I say this in the scientific sense. Not that it's good, right? There can be a virus that wipes out half the population of the human race, and a scientist will say, well, it was an elegant design. That doesn't mean that they're happy that half the human race got killed. That doesn't mean that they don't know that this is a horrific event. But what it means is the functionality, the efficiency, the leanness of the design of that virus is impressive, whether you like the outcome or not. It was very impressive and very successful. The virus was very successful. I don't want there to be a successful virus. I don't want to be sick. I don't want my kids to be sick. I don't want anyone to die. But it can be an elegant design. So I'm a therapist. I don't want my clients to suffer. But the design of a trauma bond is incredibly elegant. It's incredibly elegant. So what happens with these people? they get really confused. They're like, I know we loved each other. So this is the other thing, is this is the problem with black and white views. And even again, therapists fall into this black and white view of like, oh, this is a toxic relationship. Like, no, well, that person is very narcissistic. They don't really love you. No, bullshit. These people really loved each other and may still really love each other. It's not black and white. They are real three-dimensional human beings who fell in love. Yes, part of the reason they fell in love was because their internal, emotional, unconscious posture, their psychological posture, needs this person's trauma coping skill to justify this posture. Okay, so instead of saying it abstract, I will share with you, and I'll let my wife watch this, and if she's not okay with me sharing our personal information, then I won't. I'll clip this part, whatever. My wife and I had some level of trauma bond. We were never completely right, but we had some level of trauma bond that it took us quite a while to really work through. My wife was traumatized, among other things, by a parent who was who had taken emotional insightfulness and expressiveness and had cranked it to like a really toxic level, so that my wife had to learn to say whatever, do whatever, had to practically manipulate situations in order to make sure that her needs were met. At a very fundamental level, she had to essentially manipulate circumstances in practical ways, not emotionally, not verbally, right? Because that parent emotionally and verbally was super intense and super like out of control, right? And so she had to learn to practically manipulate. And in my case, I was more emotionally expressive, and I had been with a parent who had used that to manipulate, to practically manipulate me into things that were not good for me and to overwhelm my needs and my boundaries. And then in some ways, I was the super diplomatic person who had learned like, oh, don't express anything. But in other ways, I was actually the more emotionally expressive, who needed to be emotionally expressive, but didn't have a healthy relationship to that, right? And so there you had that situation where if I tried to emotionally express, or if I was uncomfortable with something, that was going to trigger my wife's trauma bond of like, oh crap, here's emotionality, here's someone who doesn't like the way this went down. And her trauma coping skill would be like, I'll just solve this problem by manipulating. I'll just say whatever needs to be said in the situation, or I'll create a circumstance that just bypasses what my husband is saying. And then I would use my trauma coping skill, which was verbalization and emotional analysis and blah, 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 to analyze her, why she was doing it, blah, blah, blah. So to a certain extent, we were both manipulating one another. She was circumstantially and situationally manipulating me. I was emotionally and psychologically trying to manipulate her. I wasn't trying to, but that's the end result. Like in both cases, we're not trying to manipulate one another. We're trying to problem solve with the trauma coping skill that we have. So you can see that that's a really elegant design. It's a really elegant design. So we worked through it, we did some work, and we both pulled back on our behaviors a lot. And we had to spend time just not doing it, not understanding why we're not doing it and feeling kind of unfair. It's like, well, I'm doing all this work to like not navigate you behaving in ways that I don't like. I don't like you behaving that way, and I have to just not have any response and not do anything. But we had to do that. We both had to back out and go to our separate corners, because when we did that, when we turned the attention to self, then it became apparent. For example, for me, my wife was doing things that were inappropriate, and I was doing things that were inappropriate, things that were not good for the relationship, things that didn't create connection. We were manipulating one another to attempt to solve the problem. But as long as I was like, well, I feel this way because my wife behaves this way, then she was a problem in the relationship that needed to be fixed. And no matter how subtle I was, she's not stupid. She can feel that it's like I'm making her the problem. And she also could feel that her trauma coping skill was being triggered by my instinct to either emotionally and verbally take control of the situation and manipulate, to force her to look at herself, which felt disingenuous and self-serving, when at some gut level she could feel that I had an instinct to emotionally, psychologically withdraw, right? Because if I felt manipulated, I was just going to withdraw. That's self-protective. There's nothing wrong with that. You look at my child, it's like, well, that's reasonable, but it's not working now, right? It's not working now. So once we both stepped back to our separate corners, over a period of time, I began to realize I walk around, no matter how she behaves, I walk around with this low level feeling of resentment that I have to be responsible for all of the emotional honesty, psychological and verbal honesty. I walk around with that. It was unconscious. It was there 24 hours a day. I didn't know anything else. And then I began to see that, like, once she went to her corner, I was like, let's just stop those behaviors. Just stop it. We're not even going to negotiate. Things are going to be a mess for a while because we're not, just stop. I began to be able to see, oh, it's there. It doesn't matter what she does. It's there. Now, I chose someone who behaved in a way that justified that unconscious, emotional, psychological posture. I chose someone who justified that so I could continue to feel that way for good reason. Because you could go to any therapist and really describe my wife's behavior and be like, well, of course you feel that way. How else would you feel? No, I felt that way before I met her. I spent my entire childhood feeling that way for very good reason, because my mother was extremely manipulative and controlling with me. But then as an adult, I just felt that way all the time. And I interacted with everyone all the time. And I contained and managed my emotions and my responses to things all the time, not because I was a super nice guy, although people perceived me as a nice guy, but because I didn't risk getting manipulated by people as long as I didn't emotionally, psychologically invest. I was just really nice and really diplomatic, but I was not really investing in the relationship, because as far as my unconscious emotional posture went, if I invest in the relationship, this other person is going to start trying to manipulate me and it's going to start being dishonest. And that's a huge trauma wound for me, and it will break the relationship. So in order for me to have any kind of relationship, I have to maintain this very careful distance. But that very careful distance is my wife's trauma. That distance, and then emotional, psychological, verbal manipulation is my wife's trauma. And she was going to respond by situationally manipulating, by just saying whatever words helps her get through. Like, how do I get by that? She'll just say whatever. And then for me, it was like, oh, you're full of crap. You're not even, like, what you're saying, it has no relationship to reality at all, blah, blah, right? And then I'm off into my anger and emotional expressiveness, which is her trauma. And she couldn't see her emotional posture. She couldn't change her unconscious emotional posture until I stopped bringing my trauma coping skill. And she could say, see, oh, I walk around like this. Oh, this is mine to solve. It's not my husband's. This is mine to solve. This is from old stuff. Now, if you believe in Hinduism and reincarnation and karma, then you may believe that we came into this life and we chose the partners we chose to solve a problem, to learn something, to raise our awareness. Maybe. I'm not a spiritual leader. I don't know. It begs the question. I mean, this is an incredibly elegant system that absolutely demands full consciousness, because you cannot black and white this thing. You can't be like, yeah, but maybe I shouldn't walk around feeling resentful and creating emotional distance and not trusting anyone verbally and emotionally, and having developed this extreme level of emotional honesty and verbal honesty, which for me was slightly passive aggressive, meaning I am extremely honest about what my emotional state is, extremely, but I also kind of do it a little bit as an FU to other people. It's like someone who's worked at sprinting really, really good, and you're faster than most people, and you're always like running figure eights around them, like FU. That was like my cheetah coping skill, was an extreme verbal and emotional honesty, even of my own. Like, okay, now I did that, now you. But I'm not better than other people. I was using it in an extremely dishonest way, and I was manipulative in the ways that I couldn't consciously see. So you can't black and white it, and you can't do it in half measures. It requires absolute conscious, like a total consciousness of, I'm not saying that I'm enlightened. When I say total consciousness, what I mean is, to that specific situation, it requires the ability to recognize that I chose someone who justified an emotional state that I had walked around in my entire life. And that doesn't blame me. It was not my fault that, unless you, again, go along with karma and Hinduism, which says that you chose this to learn this lesson, and that's your karma, and it's there to raise your consciousness, or whatever. I'm not getting into that. But what I'm saying is, within this lifetime, I chose someone who would allow me to continue feeling the way I felt, and to have really good reason, right? It's not that you choose someone and then project BS onto them and they're not behaving that way at all. It's that you choose someone who does behave that way so that you can have a damn good, rational, logical reason to continue feeling the way you feel. And she did the same. She chose someone who justified the emotional state and the way that she adapted and functioned, which was unpleasant for her, always chasing emotional warmth and emotional connection, and then having, these verbal, psychological manipulation come at her, and these extremes come at her, which recapitulated her trauma. And then she would become even more manipulative. But from her view, she was just trying to navigate an impossible situation where someone was behaving irrationally from her experience and view that this was dangerous. Like, she's going to like turn things off, refuse to discuss it, or she's going to discuss it in a way that's only problem solving, which I'm going to perceive as manipulative, blah, 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 right? So she chose someone who justified the emotional state that she came into the relationship with. Thank God we figured it out and are still figuring it out. On rare occasion, one or both of us will back into something and be like, "Oh yeah," and it's like, "Okay, wait, we've done this." And it's really fun once you see it and you go, "Oh," because it becomes a problem to solve. It becomes a challenge to solve. It's almost like puzzle pieces. It's this incredibly intricate lock. A trauma bond is an incredibly intricate lock. And it is our job to pick that lock. And picking the lock requires this awareness of self, full awareness of like, no, I had all these experiences. It built this unconscious, but it is your job to raise it into consciousness. Man, I geek out on a trauma bond because it begs so many spiritual, metaphysical questions that I don't have the answers to. I don't have the answers. I would love to hear what you guys think, or any spiritual leader or whatever. But I'm telling you from therapy, psychology perspective, on the surface, at a very innocent level, a trauma bond is two people who are badly hurt in their childhoods, and they choose someone who will understand what they went through and who won't be freaked out by how difficult their life was and the fact that they have difficult days and maybe weeks and blah, blah. Someone who understands and goes like, yeah, I understand, like, why you've been depressed for a month, and it's okay because I've traversed the same landscape, right? At an innocent level, that's what a trauma bond is. Sounds attractive. It doesn't work. At the next level, it's the more psychological therapist level of, we seek things that are familiar. It might be uncomfortable, it might be toxic, but it's familiar to you. Or the coping skills and adaptations you developed in your childhood is now written into your brain and your body. And so you gravitate to situations where you can use those, even though you might hate them. Or people are unconsciously seeking the same situations because they don't want to win. They felt so victimized in childhood, they felt so shamed and so helpless that they keep seeking the same situation because they want to win that situation. They want to overcome the trauma and feel competent. Maybe that's true. Maybe all of it's true. I don't know what's true about what we're doing, right? Maybe people, I can tell you that when I sought different kinds of people for a long time, I felt so intensely anxious, so massively intensely anxious, that I could not sustain relationships with people who were less manipulative or kind or less whatever it was. And it took a long time to actually train myself to go, no, they're safe. Don't keep seeking manipulative, narcissistic people, because you're going to experience all that shit you hate that makes you really angry and maintains that inner state. You're going to have to get over the anxiety of being around people who don't treat you that way, even though it's really uncomfortable. So maybe we're avoiding the anxiety of having to reinvent our way of being, right? But the next level under, the most profound level, is trauma bonds are incredibly intricate, intimate, and elegantly designed to give us an excuse to continue feeling the way we already felt coming into the relationship. My unconscious emotional, psychological posture was already there, and I move into friendships, romantic relationships, close work colleagues, whatever it is. I bond with people who their trauma coping bonds and unconscious behaviors are going to give me a damn good reason to continue feeling the way I feel, to continue maintaining that underlying emotional posture, psychological posture. That's a trauma bond. I was thinking of C.S. Lewis' book, in the Chronicles of Narnia. In one of the stories, there's a couple of kids, a boy and a girl, who go through this adventure together. They're thrown into this adventure together. They learn lessons and they bond, and they squabble over this or that. They have this fight, they have that fight. But in general, it's a beautiful friendship, and they're, lovely humans, and they overcome whatever challenges were put before them, and they meet Aslan, the lion. And the happily ever after is, he says something like, C.S. Lewis says something like, having squabbled or fought here and there over their friendship, they got married so that they could continue doing it for the rest of their lives, right? Now he's intending something that's beautiful, right? This beautiful couple who had these experiences and bonded and learned to work together and love one another and are sanctioned by Aslan, who's symbolic of Jesus. So, right, he's not saying the same thing I'm saying, but it's that funny sentiment, right? It's like, oh, we've been irritating each other all these years so wonderfully. Let's get married so we can continue irritating each other for the rest of our lives. But in a trauma bond, it's like, I have this emotional posture that's very uncomfortable, that's an indication of my lack of deep awareness of myself, of my actual psychological and emotional state. I am going to choose someone who behaves in a way that justifies my emotional state. If I go talk to a therapist, they'll say, well, your partner does behave this way, and those are some low-key toxic behaviors, and you need to navigate. But what's even harder, and I hope you have this therapist, is a therapist who knows and who can see, yes, it's not black and white. It's not either your partner's wrong or you are wrong. You did choose someone who legitimately behaves in ways that are not appropriate, they're not healthy, that don't help you move things forward. But they are behaving in a way that justifies an unconscious emotional, psychological posture that you had before you ever met them. And that unconscious psychological and emotional posture is your work. And whether you leave this person or not, right? Get into these conversations too. So like they're behaving really unhealthy. Should I move on? Am I unwilling to let go of them because I haven't done my own work? Well, it's irrelevant where you leave them or not. You will choose that. You'll work that out with your therapist if I'm like, whatever. Whether you leave them or not is irrelevant. If you choose to leave them because intellectually you make yourself do it because you're like, this is unhealthy and I'm going to set boundaries and I'm not going to do this anymore, I'm going to choose someone different, it doesn't matter. If you are unaware of the emotional, psychological posture that you carried unconsciously into that relationship, you can leave them and you are going to find someone else just like that. You'll think they were different. They'll be extroverted instead of introverted. They'll be a movie producer instead of a librarian. And you'll go, oh my God, they're totally different. Nope. The basic emotional function, the way they function in their attachment will be the same thing. If you do not figure out what your unconscious emotional psychological posture is and address it, and let it go and realize I developed that as an unconscious way of being in response to childhood trauma, or it's your karma, what the heck ever you want to believe, doesn't matter for me. I just want you to solve it. If you don't solve that, you can stay with them and it'll continue to be a toxic relationship, or you can leave them and you'll find someone else and create another trauma bond. I geek out on trauma bond. It's so elegant. It's so elegant and so intricately interwoven, so perfectly to either invite us to commit to our bullshit and be unconscious and create a toxic relationship and have kids in it if that's what we do, and pass it on to them and they grow up thinking that's normal, and to create more people believe that's normal and just put more unconsciousness and more misery and more suffering into the world. Or it's an invitation to a deep conscious awareness of this psychological, emotional way of being that has been unconscious, that I have viewed simply as what reality is, when it's my posture. It is my job to become aware that that is a posture and it is unnecessary, and that I can choose otherwise, and that being conscious and seeing it helps me choose otherwise, helps me let go of it. Helps me let go of it because it is not me. It is just a trauma coping skill. It's just an adaptation. You are not an adaptation. You are a conscious sentient being. You are not an adaptation. So it's an invitation. It's an invitation to let go of that adaptation, that biological response, that evolutionary response to a difficult situation, to become consciously aware of it and let go of it. And invite your partner to consciousness. Or if they are incapable of becoming conscious of their part in it, their part in the trauma bond, then yes, the healthy thing is ultimately you will choose your way out and you will move on because you want to model something else for your children, or because there's no point in being conscious and being in relationship to unconsciousness. Unconsciousness is just a tape loop. It's just a mechanism, a cause and effect mechanism going, when these things happen, biology does this in response to it. It's just an animal instinct. It's just going to run that over and over, just going to run it compulsively. That person's not conscious. Like, what if you're conscious, what are you doing there? There's no one to relate to. That person is not awake. They're not awake. There's no one to relate to. Who are you going to relate to? Who are you going to love? And who are you going to be loved by? But if you're rejecting them like, well, they're full of crap and I don't allow people to, and it's very intellectual and ego driven, it means you have not seen your part in it. You have not seen that you chose someone who justifies your emotional posture that you brought into the relationship. And if you don't solve that, you can stay or you can leave. It makes no difference. You have not brought conscious awareness to your biological evolutionary adaptation that no longer serves you. You are being invited to consciousness. You are being invited. You are either being seduced into unconsciousness and continuing unconsciousness and suffering, or you being invited to consciousness. Wake up. Wake up to you. Wake up to how the human animal adapts, and then let go of that, because you're more than an animal. You're more than an instinct. You are a conscious, sentient being. You are awareness. Wake up. So maybe it's possible. Now I'm straying into the spiritual or metaphysical, like whatever. Maybe it's possible that that's what suffering is for. To invite us to conscious awareness, to invite us to let go of what is not us, to invite us to let go of mechanistic biological trauma coping skills, to invite us to see that when there are people who are hurting us, if we maintain this relationship and we fight and we delve into unconsciousness and anger and resentment and all of these things in response to them being unconscious, it's not on them. Yes, their behavior, they're responsible for their behavior, but your unconsciousness is your task. It is your job to raise into awareness that you brought an emotional and psychological posture into that relationship. In fact, you bring it into everything. You are not at fault for what happened to you as a child. It is not your fault that your parent was deeply unconscious and abused you or neglected you, shamed you, hurt you. It is not your fault. It's not your fault that you have the trauma coping skill, but it is your responsibility. And it is the only way out. Psychologically, spiritually, relationally, like however the hell you want to look at it, it is the only way out, is to become aware of your deep emotional pattern and go, oh, either I'm being seduced into unconsciousness or I'm being invited to conscious awareness. Maybe that's the purpose. I don't know. Go consult your spiritual leader. I really geek out on trauma bonds. It is a trip. And so few people really understand how deep it is at that level. Most people think it's the second level down, right? Some people think it's that innocent level. Most people think it's that second level down. Man, you really get under the hood and how intricate and elegant it is. And yet the outcome is simple. It's not binary, either my partner's bad or I'm bad. My partner should feel ashamed or I should feel ashamed. It's not binary that way. It's binary in that there are only two possible outcomes. You can either learn and raise your awareness. It's an invitation to put your consciousness and be aware of what you brought into that relationship, or it's a seduction into unconsciousness, which can actually degrade. You can be even more abusive and chaotic and create situations where some of your children are even more, and then they choose a partner with a severe trauma bond. You know, there are cases where this stuff decays and degrades. It becomes worse and worse and worse. And you end up having horribly abusive, dysfunctional families who destroy their own kids emotionally, psychologically. Somewhere in there, someone is being in, well, we're all being invited to consciousness. But someone will stand up and go, okay, I'm going to be conscious. It's so beautiful when you do it. When you have that awareness of like, oh, this part was for me to solve. It doesn't feel like, oh, that's gross, it's unfair. It feels like, oh my God, there's such a relief that you see how this thing fits together. It's this intricate lock, but consciousness has all of the intelligence needed to see the intricacies. And once you see it, you're like, it's not that complicated. It's not that complicated. I brought this unconscious thing. I chose a partner who justifies it. Their behavior's on them, but it's on me that I remain unaware that I brought this, and now I'm using them to justify this. I'm responsible for using them to justify this and then blaming them. They're responsible for their behavior, but I'm responsible for this unconscious emotional state and for the coping mechanisms that come out of it. Not my fault that it got built in, but it is mine to solve. Trauma bond, folks. All right, that's all I have to say about that. Hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.
Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.